By the time the frost first kissed the ground in early November, Abram had already felt the weight of the coming winter. His small farm was tucked away in the hills, isolated from the world. When the storm came, it would be his family and their faith that would pull them through, not the quick fixes of neighbors or the comforts of convenience. Before we begin, share where you're watching from. And if stories of faith, simplicity, and survival resonate with you, join us for tomorrow's tale. The harvest had been meager that year. Abram stood at the doorway of the root cellar, looking over his collection of jars and sacks, the humble bounty they had gathered. His rough hands ran over the sealed lids of the jars, feeling the cool glass beneath his fingertips. Pickled beets, carrots, and apples, jam jars and bottles of thick golden honey. The sight of the food gave him a measure of peace, but the long stretch of the coming winter gnawed at his gut. He had prepared as best as he could, but the whispers of the neighbors still echoed in his mind. "It'll be a hard one, Abram. You should have planted more." They meant well, but their words had always lacked understanding. The soil here was stubborn, unwilling to yield more than what the land allowed. Abram had no choice but to trust in his faith and in the seasons. He would harvest what he could and pray it would be enough. As the last of the evening light faded, a deep quiet fell over the farm. The wind picked up, a cold gust that seemed to warn of something coming. Abram had spent the last few weeks checking his barn, securing every loose post and lock. His neighbors had built their homes quickly and cheaply, often overlooking details in favor of speed. But Abram's house, the one he had built by hand, brick by brick, had been constructed for a different purpose. He had taken the time to insulate the walls thickly, layered each window with multiple panes of glass. The cold might threaten everything outside, but inside he hoped it would be a different story. He stepped back into the warmth of his kitchen, his wife Ruth already busy at the stove. The simple scent of freshly baked bread filled the room. The heat from the stove was a comfort, but Abram knew it would only last for so long. Ruth noticed his silence and looked up. "You've been out there too long. The storm's coming. What's on your mind?" "I'm ready for it," Abram said, his voice steady, but it was a lie. He knew that no one could be truly ready for what the winter would bring. His mind wandered to the supply of wood he'd carefully stacked, to the blankets in the corner, but it all felt so fragile, like a stack of kindling waiting to be ignited. That night, as they sat around the table, Abram's mind stayed on the coming storm. It wasn't just the cold. The fear was buried deeper than that. What if his careful preparations, the painstaking work of months, didn't stand up to what was coming? Could they make it through? Could he protect his family? The first snowflakes began to fall in the early hours of the morning, drifting silently against the window panes. Abram awoke with a start, as if the world had suddenly shifted around him. Ruth was still asleep beside him, her breathing steady. He slipped from under the thick quilt, his bare feet meeting the cool wooden floor. He dressed quickly, his breath fogging in the cold room. He lit the lantern and carried it through the dark hallway toward the cellar. It was still too early to know what the storm would bring, but Abram's heart beat a little faster with the weight of responsibility. The cellar was still full, but the heavy weight of time pressed down. A fire crackled softly in the hearth as Abram stepped into the cellar, the flickering light casting long shadows on the wooden shelves. He examined the jars once more, inspecting their seals and checking for any signs of spoilage. The applesauce glowed faintly through the glass, the soft orange color a reminder of the summer's bounty. The canned peaches, the jars of beans, he had enough to see them through the months. He counted the sacks of potatoes and the preserves on the shelves. It would be close, but it would be enough, wouldn't it? As the storm raged outside, Abram prepared himself mentally for what was to come. He had always believed in the strength of preparation, but his heart tightened as he thought of Ruth and their 2 young children upstairs. Could he protect them in the way he had promised? Could they survive the storm? The morning hours passed slowly. The wind howled louder, rattling the house's windows as if it were testing the integrity of Abram's home. His house had stood firm through many storms, but this was different. No storm had ever been quite like this. It felt like the earth itself was shifting beneath him. He stood by the door, his hand resting on the heavy oak frame, listening to the rhythm of the storm. Every crash of wind against the wood, every creak of the old house filled him with a quiet determination. He knew that survival wasn't just about weathering the physical storm, it was about holding steady in the face of uncertainty. The storm had settled into a bitter, relentless howl by the time the sun dipped low. Abram and Ruth had spent the day inside, tending to the fire and ensuring the children were bundled warmly in bed. The cold crept into every corner of the house, but the thick walls held steady. The wind still carried the weight of winter's threat. But inside, the quiet hum of their daily life provided a measure of comfort. But Abram couldn't sleep. He lay awake, the weight of responsibility heavy on his chest. Ruth's soft breathing beside him was the only sound that comforted him, but even that seemed distant. In the deep quiet of the night, the storm became an oppressive force, a constant reminder of the battle between nature's unforgiving cold and the warmth they had built together. Outside, the snow piled higher, the howling wind creating drifts that swallowed everything in its path. Abram knew the weather would only worsen. By morning, the world outside would be unrecognizable, the land transformed into an endless sheet of white. He felt an odd sense of peace in this certainty, like he had no choice but to trust the season's cycle, even if it meant surrendering control. In the kitchen, the smell of hot soup and fresh bread filled the air as Ruth moved about, preparing a simple meal for the morning. Her presence grounded him in the midst of his thoughts. Ruth had always been the heart of their home, her steady hands a balm for his restless spirit. Her faith never wavered, and it was that quiet confidence that kept him from losing hope. She moved with a grace that Abram admired, her every action deliberate, as if she knew something deeper than the physical world around them. He watched her, the flickering lantern casting soft shadows across her face. "You're quiet tonight," Ruth said, her voice gentle, as if she had sensed the weight in the air. "What's on your mind?" Abram hesitated for a moment, the truth heavy on his tongue. "I fear for us, Ruth. The storm's a fierce one this year." "I've never seen it like this. What if we don't make it through?" Ruth set down her spoon and walked over to him, taking his hand. Her touch was warm, her grip firm. "We have each other, Abram, and we have our faith. That's all we need." Her words were simple, but they struck him with the force of a deep truth. They had prepared as best they could, and now all they could do was trust in the strength of their home, their community, and their faith. There was no room for fear, not here, not in the quiet strength of what they had built together. The wind continued to rage outside, but inside their small home, Abram felt the weight on his chest lighten, if only for a moment. His hand found Ruth's, and together they prayed for the strength to face what lay ahead. Morning came slowly, gray light filtering through the thick snow that blanketed the world outside. Abram awoke early, as he always did, his body attuned to the rhythm of the land. He rose from their bed and made his way to the small window, peering out into the swirling whiteness. The snow had not let up through the night. In fact, it had only deepened the silence of the world beyond. The house felt colder now, even with the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Abram quickly dressed in layers, then stepped into his boots. The wind bit at his skin as he opened the door and stepped outside. His breath froze in the air, and the deep silence of the storm surrounded him like a blanket. The farm had disappeared beneath the snow. The barn, the fields, the fences, everything was swallowed in a sea of white. Abram had known storms before, but this felt different. The weight of the snow, the way the wind seemed to howl with more fury, made it feel as though the earth itself was holding its breath. He moved quickly, setting to work securing the barn doors. He had already filled the stalls with hay, stored enough grain to last for months. But the animals needed attention. They were counting on him. The barn door creaked as he pulled it open, the wind pushing back with a ferocity that made him struggle to keep it in place. Inside, the animals stirred, their breath visible in the frigid air. Abram worked quickly, feeding them, making sure they had enough hay to keep warm through the long night. The cows' steady chewing and the soft snorts of the horses were comforting in the chaos outside. As he worked, Abram's mind wandered to his neighbors. The McFarlands, the Millers, the Yoders, how were they faring? He knew that the storms here could isolate even the most well-prepared families. His family had enough provisions to survive, but what about others? The community he depended on might need him more than ever, but he could do little to help them until the storm passed. After finishing with the animals, Abram stood in the barn doorway, surveying the vast, unbroken snow. His thoughts lingered on the community. The storm had made it impossible to travel, but it also reinforced something deeper, his sense of responsibility toward those around him. He had prepared for his family, but it was clear that the true test would be whether they could support each other in a time of crisis. With a deep sigh, Abram closed the barn door against the wind and trudged back to the house. The storm continued to rage, but inside, his family waited. His thoughts turned to Ruth, who would be ready with another meal, with another word of encouragement. Together, they would face this just as they had always done. The storm had come, but it was not their first challenge. The faith, love, and preparation they'd built over the years were the foundation they stood upon, and it would be enough. With the heavy weight of the snow on his shoulders, Abram returned to his home, where warmth and light awaited. The storm had not let up. For days the world outside had been buried beneath a blanket of snow, the wind carrying the chill of the mountains into every corner of the house. The once crisp scent of firewood now mingled with the smell of cooking stew as Ruth prepared their evening meal. The glow from the hearth cast long shadows on the walls, and the quiet ticking of the clock on the mantel was the only sound that filled the room. Inside, the family remained safe, but outside, the storm was a constant reminder of the fragility of life on the frontier. Abram sat by the window, looking out at the white expanse. The wind howled, and the snow continued to pile high against the wooden shutters. The world beyond the walls of their home had become unrecognizable, but inside they were warm, safe. The fire crackled in the hearth, a steady hum that comforted him. He turned his gaze from the window and watched Ruth as she worked. She moved with the quiet grace that was always so grounding for him. Ruth's soft humming filled the room, a song of comfort that carried them through the long nights. Their children, both tucked snugly in their beds, slept soundly, unaware of the danger outside. Abram had done all he could to prepare, but the uncertainty still gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the worry of what the coming days would bring. Abram, Ruth's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. The children are well, and we have food. Our faith is enough. You need not carry this burden alone. He turned to face her, his tired eyes meeting hers. There was no reproach in her gaze, only understanding. She had always been the steady rock that held him when he faltered. And yet, even with all that they had, he couldn't shake the fear of what could come next. I fear the worst is yet to come, Abram said, his voice low. The cold, Ruth. It's not like anything I've felt before. What if we're not enough? Ruth placed a hand on his, her warmth a quiet reassurance. We've made it this far, Abram. We have each other. That is all that matters. The truth of her words echoed in his heart. Together, they could face anything. This house, built with their own hands, stood as a testament to their strength and faith. Outside, the storm howled, but inside they had warmth, they had food, and they had each other. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, a sharp, urgent rap that echoed through the small home. Abram's heart skipped a beat. Who could be out in this storm? Ruth stood quickly, concern flickering in her eyes. Who would be foolish enough to come now? I'll see, Abram said, rising to his feet. The storm raged outside, but he stepped to the door, cautiously opening it. To his surprise, it was Nathan Miller, his neighbor, standing at the threshold. His coat was heavy with snow, his face pale from the cold. He was shivering, his hands pressed together as if he were trying to gather warmth. "Nathan, what in the world are you doing out there?" Abram asked, stepping aside to allow him in. "The storm. It's worse than we thought, Abram." Nathan's voice was shaking. "The barn roof. It's caving in. We couldn't get the animals inside. Can you help? We've no shelter for them." Abram's heart sank. He looked at Ruth, and she gave him a silent nod. There was no question now. They had what they needed, but the test of their faith had come. Without hesitation, Abram turned back to Nathan. "I'll help you. We'll save them." The wind was unforgiving as Abram and Nathan made their way through the knee-deep snow to Nathan's barn. The storm, relentless as ever, had already covered the ground in a thick layer of snow, and the bitter cold nipped at their exposed skin. Abram's breath billowed out in thick clouds as they walked, his mind racing with the task ahead. The barn loomed ahead, its roof sagging heavily under, the weight of the snow, the structure groaning against the storm. It was clear that Nathan had done his best to prepare, but there was little anyone could do when the forces of nature were so determined. The sight of the collapsing roof made Abram's heart tighten. His family's safety had been secured, but now their neighbors needed help. This was the moment that tested everything they had worked for, their faith, their resources, and their resolve. "We have to get them inside," Nathan said, his voice filled with urgency. "If we don't act quickly, we'll lose them." "I know," Abram replied, his hands already at work, clearing snow from the barn's door. With Nathan's help, they pried the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The barn was cold, the animals huddled together, their breath visible in the frozen air. Abram scanned the room quickly, assessing the situation. There was no time to waste. "We'll need to get the cows out first," Abram said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "They're the biggest. Let's get the others into the stalls." They worked quickly, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. Abram had spent many years of his life in barns, guiding animals through harsh winters, but this was different. This wasn't just a job. It was a fight for survival. They led the animals into the safe corners of the barn, their hooves clattering against the frozen ground as Abram and Nathan guided them. The snow continued to pour in through the cracks in the walls, but they worked tirelessly to keep the shelter as warm as possible. Minutes passed, then hours. By the time they had moved the last of the animals inside, the barn was in a state of disarray, but it was secure. They'd done what they could. "I think they're safe now," Nathan said, his voice exhausted but relieved. "We've done it, Abram. We've saved them." Abram nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. He stepped back, taking a moment to catch his breath. The storm outside raged on, but inside the barn he felt a sense of quiet pride. This was what it meant to be a part of something larger than yourself, to give without thought of reward, and to help others, even when the world outside seemed intent on tearing everything down. As the storm raged through the night, Abram sat with Nathan in the barn, both men silent in the glow of the small lantern they had brought along. The night was long, and the wind outside was a reminder that nothing was certain, but they had survived another test. And in the quiet aftermath, Abram knew that their faith, their community, and their resolves would carry them through whatever the winter brought next. Together they would make it. The morning after the storm felt different. The wind had finally ceased its howling, but in its wake it left behind a stillness that was both eerie and comforting. Abram woke early, as he always did, but this time he could feel the weight of the night's labor in his bones. The cold crept into the corners of their home, but inside the fire still crackled softly. Ruth had already risen, her quiet movements like the gentle hum of the household's heartbeat. She smiled at Abram as he joined her at the hearth, the light from the fire reflecting in her tired but steady eyes. "I heard you last night," she said softly. I knew you would help Nathan. You always do. Abram nodded, the weight of the previous day's work settling on his shoulders like an old coat. The barn had been saved, the animals protected, but the price of survival was never cheap. He had given everything he had, but he still couldn't shake the lingering fear in his chest. The winter was far from over, and there was no guarantee the storm wouldn't return with greater force. He looked down at his hands, calloused from the work of the land and the weight of responsibility that never let go. I did what I could, he said quietly, his voice rough. But I can't shake this feeling that something more is coming. The storm, Ruth. It's just the beginning, isn't it? Ruth set down the spoon she was stirring with and took Abram's hands in hers. Her touch was a gentle reminder of the strength that they shared. We're ready for whatever comes, Abram. We've always been ready. We have our faith, and we have each other. That's enough. Her words rang true, but Abram couldn't quiet the doubt that still gnawed at him. In the back of his mind, he wondered if their faith would be enough to withstand what lay ahead. The land was unyielding, the winters unforgiving, and the world beyond their doorstep was as unpredictable as the storms that came without warning. Still, Abram knew that Ruth was right. They had each other. They had built this life together brick by brick, with sweat and sacrifice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The children were still asleep, their soft breaths the only sound that filled the room. Abram watched them for a moment, feeling the deep pull of fatherly love. His children were his legacy, the ones who would carry on the traditions of the farm, the ones who would learn the lessons of humility, resilience, and faith. He would protect them no matter what. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the sun finally peeked through the thick clouds that had loomed overhead for days. The sky was a muted gray, but the soft light was enough to give the world a sense of renewal. Abram felt a small flicker of hope as he stepped outside, the crunch of fresh snow beneath his boots a reminder that life, no matter how difficult, would continue. He turned to Ruth, his heart swelling with gratitude. "We'll make it, won't we?" She nodded, her voice steady. "With faith and love, we'll always make it." And with that, Abram stepped forward, ready for the next challenge, knowing that no matter what came, he would face it with the strength of his family and their shared faith. The days that followed were marked by a quiet tension. The storm had passed, but the threat of winter's full force still hung in the air like an unspoken promise. The snow continued to fall in soft, steady flurries, covering the earth in a pristine white blanket. It was beautiful, but Abram knew better than to let the peaceful appearance fool him. The land had a way of revealing its true nature when least expected. Each morning, Abram checked the barn and the cellar, ensuring that both were still intact. The animals were safe, but the cold had begun to bite deeper. He doubled down on his work, chopping more firewood, securing the last of the grain, and tending to the last of the winter preparations. Ruth helped where she could, her hands always busy, her focus unwavering. She, too, had a quiet strength that Abram admired. But despite their efforts, there was a heaviness that both of them felt. Abram could see it in the way Ruth's eyes lingered on the window as the snow piled higher outside, and he felt it in the way his own steps slowed with the weight of every task he completed. The cold was getting deeper, the nights growing longer, and the promise of spring felt distant, almost unreachable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ruth and Abram sat together by the fire. The children were in bed, and the world outside was as still as the night air. There was no wind now, just the quiet hiss of the fire crackling in the hearth. It was a rare moment of peace, and Abram took it in, savoring the silence. "I think we've done all we can," Abram said, his voice tired but resolute. "We've prepared the best we could for this winter. If the storms continue, if the cold gets worse, we'll have to trust in the things we can't control." Ruth nodded, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "We've always done that, Abram, trusted in things beyond our sight, and that's enough." The truth of her words washed over him like a warm blanket. They couldn't control the weather, nor could they predict what would happen next. But they had done everything within their power to prepare. In the end, it wasn't the harvest, the barn, or even the firewood that would see them through. It was their faith, the faith that had carried them this far, and the faith that would continue to guide them through the unknown. As the night stretched on, Abram took Ruth's hand, feeling the familiar weight of her touch. Together they had built a life rooted in faith, family, and the land. They had endured much already, and whatever came next, they would face it together. Abram looked out the window once more, the cold moonlight casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this. As long as he had his family, his faith, and the land they had worked so hard to cultivate, he would be ready. And that, he realized, was enough. The fire burned softly, and Abram settled back into his chair, at peace for the moment. The storm might return, but they would endure. The strength of their home, their love, and their faith was unshakable. And that was the greatest preparation of all. The sun rose weakly over the snow-covered farm, casting a pale light that seemed to struggle against the heavy clouds still lingering in the sky. Abram stood by the window once more, gazing out at the landscape. The storm had passed, but its legacy remained. The snowdrifts were high, and the biting wind that had been the storm's constant companion was still present, though now it seemed to sigh more than howl. Ruth was busy preparing breakfast, the rich smell of cornbread filling the kitchen, the steady sound of her work as comforting as the fire crackling in the hearth. She hummed softly to herself, a song of old that Abram hadn't heard in years, and it brought with it a sense of peace, a reminder of the rhythm of their lives. They had lived through hardships before, and while the challenges of this winter felt immense, there was something about the simplicity of their life that grounded him. "I've been thinking," Abram said quietly, his voice barely rising above the sound of the wind outside. Ruth paused, her hands stilling for a moment as she turned to face him. He could see the question in her eyes, the silent request for him to continue. "About the coming weeks. We've prepared as best we can, but this winter, it's unlike anything I've seen. The food will hold, the firewood should last. But what about when the snow doesn't stop? When the days turn to weeks?" His voice trailed off as his gaze returned to the window, his thoughts swirling with the unknowns of what lay ahead. Ruth walked over to him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "We will make it, Abram. We always do. If we have enough faith in each other and in what we've built, we'll survive this, just like we've survived every storm before." Her words were soft, but there was an unshakable truth in them. Abram knew that their strength was not just in what they had gathered or in the warmth of their home, but in their ability to hold on to what mattered. Family, faith, hope. As they sat down to eat, Abram's thoughts kept returning to the challenges of the season. Winter on the farm was never easy, but this year it felt as if nature was testing them more than ever. The food they had stored in the cellar, the firewood stacked high in the corner, those were the things they depended on for survival. But there was something more essential than all of that, the strength of the bond they shared. Ruth, the children, and the quiet peace of their simple home. After breakfast, Abram bundled up in his thick coat and stepped outside to survey the farm. The air was sharp, each breath he took a reminder of the unforgiving cold. He trudged through the snow, checking the barn again, making sure the animals were safe and well fed. They were still huddled. Together, their warm bodies providing the only comfort in the otherwise desolate landscape. As Abram worked, his mind wandered to the future. How much longer would this winter last? Would the storms continue to batter them, or would the land eventually give way to spring's gentle touch? He didn't know, but one thing was certain. No matter how harsh the weather, they would endure. They always had. Returning to the warmth of the house, Abram felt a sense of peace settle over him. The storm had tested them, yes, but it had also reminded him of the strength he had in his family and in their shared faith. It was enough to face whatever came next. As the days passed, the world outside remained a quiet, white expanse, the snow never quite letting up. Abram had long since lost count of how many days had passed since the last storm. The hours had blurred into each other, marked only by the rhythms of life inside the house. The fire still burned brightly, the food still lasted, and the days still unfolded in the same steady rhythm. But there was a quiet tension in the air, a weight that Abram couldn't shake. It wasn't fear exactly, but the nagging knowledge that this winter had yet to fully reveal its power. The harsh winds had continued to howl, and while they had managed to survive the worst of the storm, the cold seemed to press closer, as if it were trying to squeeze out any warmth left in the world. Abram spent much of his time checking the barn, stacking firewood, and making sure the cellar stores were in good condition. Ruth worked alongside him, ever the steadfast partner, ensuring that the house remained warm and the children safe. The work was simple, necessary, but Abram could see the fatigue in her eyes. Winter was always hard, but this year it felt different. One evening, after a long day of work, Abram sat down by the fire, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Ruth joined him, her warm presence a quiet comfort. She didn't need to ask what was on his mind. She knew. "It's not just the cold, Ruth," Abram said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's the waiting. We've done everything we can, but it's as though the land itself is holding its breath, waiting for something more to come. I don't know if we're ready for it." Ruth sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "We are ready, Abram. We've been ready all along. We've prepared, and we've lived the way we know we must, faithfully, humbly together. That's the only thing we can control. The rest we leave to God." Her words, simple as they were, brought a sense of clarity to Abram. He had spent so much time focused on the unknowns, the what-ifs, that he had forgotten the most important truth. They had already prepared. They had already done everything they could. They had each other, and that was enough. As the night deepened and the wind continued to whip outside, Abram allowed himself to settle into the warmth of the moment. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the children slept soundly upstairs, oblivious to the storm still raging outside. Ruth's hand in his, the steady rhythm of their home, was all he needed to face whatever came next. The world beyond their door might remain cold and uncertain, but inside they had warmth, they had love, and they had faith. Together, that would see them through. The storm might continue, but they would endure. Always.